Today, we are here once again to examine the ongoing sentiment of U.S. consumers with our good friend, Jonathan Sharp, the Managing Director of the A&M Consumer and Retail Group. Jonathan, how are you?
Thanks, Chris. And I'm very good indeed. Thank you very much. It's that time of year again. We've got another interesting consumer survey. You know, we love this stuff.
Yeah, I can't wait to get to it. But before we start, Jonathan, you have a good cause you want to tell the audience about.
That's very kind of you, Chris. Thank you so much. Yes, in a couple of weeks' time, I will be running the London Marathon. And then in the fall, I'll be running the New York Marathon. And for both of those, I am fundraising for Alzheimer's research, which incidentally is only one of the top 10 illnesses in the world that doesn't have a cure or a medical treatment that can alleviate it. So research in that space is hugely important. I'm fundraising for it. I'll send you the link to my donation page.
All right, Jonathan, let's start with this then. In the A&M Consumer and Retail Group's Fall 2022 Consumer Sentiment Survey, you found U.S. consumer sentiment was down amid concerns of inflation and their own financial well-being. What does the Spring 2023 Sentiment Survey tell us about how they are all feeling 6 months later?
Do you know, it's a really peculiar survey. I mean, I trust the consumer, but the consumer is saying something slightly odd. They're kind of saying, yes, I read the same press reports as everyone else, and inflation's still around, and everyone's talking about a coming recession. But you know what? I'm unlocking my wallet and I'm spending. So you have this very peculiar, at the macro level, the consumer saying, yeah, I can see dark clouds on the horizon. But when you get into the detail, the consumer is signaling a few things. One, they're spending more on indulgences, gifts and experiences. So the kind of the classical things that were getting cut back a few months ago. And there are also sort of a couple of other very strong signals that the consumer's unlocking and willing to spend. They're moving from fresh foods to prepared foods. That's always a signal that they're sort of indulging themselves a little bit more in the grocery store. And intention to take a vacation this spring and summer is up significantly over last year. So it's as if we're kind of watching the world, but determined to enjoy ourselves in the meantime.
Jonathan, this is a pretty big shift from previous surveys, especially in the wake of the inflation that we actually are seeing in the market. What is giving consumers this optimism?
Yeah, so I think that's right. And there are a few things going on. First of all, the consumer is not ignoring inflation, right? So basic needs are still consuming most of their spending, and they think that that will continue to be the case. But when you ask them about their personal finances, in the next 6 months, the majority of expect them to be earning more, and most importantly, actually saving more, which is a big change from our previous surveys. It's not like all of their earnings are now going on sort of gas and fuel and food. And then a couple of other demographics that are going on. Younger age group considerably more optimistic about the next 6 months and have a real willingness to spend. And the other big shift from the fall is that higher income groups, which late last year had begun to kind of get on the kind of the grumpy train and had begun to kind of worry about inflation, and it was even hitting them. Well, they've completely reversed that position, and they are very optimistic about the future, and they're sort of very willing to spend.
So, Jonathan, as we're deep into spring here and we're heading into summer, where can we expect the bulk of the spend to start to happen?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a real reversion in those groups, those categories of spending that had struggled in the depths of kind of inflation worries late last year. So I would look out for wellness, fitness, travel, home improvement, apparel. Apparel actually saw one of the biggest jumps of all of the categories we survey in terms of intention to spend more. And those are all classic kind of discretionary categories, the things that we'd put off when our heating and gas prices were eroding a lot of our spending power. Those things have really come back in this spring cycle. And then just one other thing on vacations, anything vacation related, I think is going to have a very good spring, summer. And in particular, I guess if you're selling larger size luggage, you're going to do well because the intention to travel internationally is up considerably versus last year. The COVID shadow is completely gone. We want to travel. We want to see Europe. We're going to be getting on long haul flights.
Well, Jonathan, what are the things that retailers should be doing then to capitalize on this shift in consumer optimism?
Well, see, here's one thing I am slightly worried about for our retail clients, which is you'll know, right? The spirit of the last few months has been manage down inventory.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we're about to go on one of those supply chain switchback rides, and
Oh no.
Here comes the consumer. Is the inventory there? I think that's going to be a real challenge through this cycle if the consumer does behave as they're indicating here. I think there's also related to that, I guess retailers should be a bit careful about their promotional policy. As the consumer becomes a bit more indulgent, you might not want to give away quite so much, particularly if you're going to have to be agile with your supply chain, because you don't want to create sort of artificial spikes in an environment in which inventory is kind of getting challenged. Just a couple of other things I'd flag. We've asked a question for the last, I think it's 4 or 5 cycles, about what's the barrier to spending. And you won't be surprised that during COVID, that was health concerns. And then as inflation kicked in, it was about pricing. What's interesting is that we've seen a significant jump in consumers saying the barrier to be spending more is the experience or the service that I get in store. And I think this is kind of another indication of this sort of return to normal and this return to kind of the consumer as king. They're looking out for good or bad service. And we all know what's happened to labor in the last 12 months, right? So watch your inventory and watch your service levels.
Wow, great stuff. Thank you,
Thanks,
Jonathan, as always.